All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's AI Tech Agora. Today, our speaker is Scott Robbins. Before passing the word to him, I see that we have quite a lot of new faces here. So I'll give a very quick introduction into who we are. So I'm Arkady. I'm a postdoc at Delft University of Technology. And here we have a really nice multidisciplinary, multi-faculty initiative called AI Tech. And at AI Tech, we look into different aspects of what we call meaningful human control. So we are focusing not only on kind of general philosophical aspects of it, but also on concrete engineering challenges posed by it. So if you're interested in this, check out our website, tudelft.nl/AITech, and also subscribe to our Twitter and YouTube channel to stay updated of the future meetings. And if nothing else comes up, I'll pass the word to Scott.
All right, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, Arkady and AI Tech, for inviting me. I'm pretty excited to give this talk. I'd hoped it would be in person, but alas, we will have to make do. So while I share my screen really fast, can everybody see that now? Can somebody let me know if you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. All right. Sounds good. All right. Thank you. So a little bit about me. I'm just finishing up my PhD at the Ethics of Philosophy and Technology section at TU Delft at the TPM faculty. I'm writing on machine learning and counterterrorism and the ethics and efficacy of that. And this is a paper that didn't make it into the thesis that I just submitted on Monday. But it's something that I think the thesis kind of leaves unsaid and kind of leaves to future work that I'm really hoping to get out there as soon as possible. And right now I'm titling it, What Machines Shouldn't Do, a Necessary Condition for Meaningful Human Control. All right, so before I say anything about what machines shouldn't be doing, I have to clarify what I mean by what a machine does. And when a machine is doing something, or more specifically, when we have delegated a process or a decision to a machine. And what I mean by this, and for the purposes of this paper and this presentation, is that a machine has done something, or we have delegated a decision to a machine, when a machine can reach an output through considerations and the weighting of those considerations not explicitly given by humans. So the point of me doing this and to making this clarification is that I want to distinguish between more classical AI, like good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, symbolic AI, or expert systems and things like that, from machine learning or contemporary AI. And in the classical good old-fashioned AI, the considerations that we that go into making a particular generating a particular output are explicitly put there by human beings. It may be extremely complicated. It may look, it may still simulate our intelligence in some way, and we may believe it's doing more than it is. But really, there's human beings behind that path that it's following to generate the output. And this is in contrast to machine learning, or many methodologies in machine learning, where the specific considerations that go into generating an output are unknown to any human beings, but even the human beings that programmed it. So that's the case in much of the hype surrounding AI today, and many of the successes that we've seen in the media, like AlphaGo beating the world Go champion, or chess algorithms, or many of the other algorithms out there. So we've delegated a decision to a machine, or in this example here, the move in the game of Go, to a machine, because that machine actually has its own considerations, loosely speaking, for how it generates the output. So this, we've delegated, in the way that I'm talking about it, we've delegated many decisions to machines, everything from detecting whether somebody's suspicious or not, to predicting crime, to driving our cars, diagnosing patients, and sentencing people to prison. Going even more, fraud detection, facial recognition, object recognition, and even choosing our outfits for us. And in developing this presentation, I saw a lot of really random algorithms out there, or applications out there. And so with all these applications, I think some of them kind of freak us out, and I think autonomous weapon systems are some of the ones that really come to mind as the most classic example of something that comes to mind that scares us about, like, should we be really doing this with an algorithm, or how can we do this responsibly? And it's fueled this huge explosion in AI ethics. I think a justified explosion in AI ethics, because I think there's something novel happening here. This is the first time we're really delegating these processes to machines, not just automating the processes we've already determined, but actually delegating the act of choosing these considerations to machines. And so now we're worried about the control we have over those machines. And specifically, I think that all of these AI ethics principle lists and a lot of the work on AI ethics, whether it's made explicit or not, is really talking about, or adding to in some way, trying to realize meaningful human control. And so before I get to the specifics of what I want to add to meaningful human control, I wanted to say a little bit about some of the proposals that are out there already, and a little bit about how I classify them. I have made a distinction between technology-centered meaningful human control and human-centered meaningful human control. And what I mean by that distinction is what I'm trying to capture here is where people are putting the spotlight or putting their focus on realizing meaningful human control. So if it's technology-centered, then we're really thinking about the technology itself. What are the design requirements of the technology, or what can we, add to the technology so that we are better equipped to realize meaningful human control? Whereas in the human-centered approaches, it's more about where can we place the human and what capacities or capabilities does the human being need in order to realize meaningful human control. So starting with technology-centered meaningful human control, there's a few proposals out there that I consider to be the biggest ones. And I don't mean to say that these are all necessarily put out there explicitly to realize meaningful human control. It's not like these papers are all saying, this is a proposal for meaningful human control. But I've argued in the past that some of these are indeed doing that, or that would be the moral problem that they're trying to solve, if they're solving one. So first is explicability and explainable AI, which is the idea that if we can make an algorithm output not only its output, but also give us some kind of idea of how it came to that output in terms of considerations that went into that output. This could perhaps allow us to say, well, that was a bad, that output should be rejected because it was based on race or gender or something like that, something we consider to be not an acceptable way to make a particular decision. I've written a paper on this this proposal, and I'm not too thrilled with it. I think that it's a good idea, but it fails. And there's still a good idea to try to make AI explainable. I still think there's reasons to do it, but it doesn't solve the moral problem that it attempts to solve, if that's what it's doing. And I can talk more about that, or I can direct you towards the paper about that in the question and answer period. Then we move on to machine ethics, which I think is not necessarily a proposal for realizing meaningful human control, but it is a way to say that that it's saying that if we can endow machines with moral reasoning capabilities and allow them to pick out morally salient features and adjust and be responsive to those features, then we don't need humans to be in control anymore. Really, the machines and robots and algorithms are controlling themselves with these, ethical capabilities. I couldn't be more negative about this approach. And I think some of that has to do with the reasons that I'm going to get into later on. But I've also written a paper about this with Amy Van Weinsberg, where we argue that there's no good reason to do this. Every reason put forward fails for either empirical or conceptual reasons. And again, I can talk more about that, and hopefully it becomes more clear throughout this presentation, at least one of the reasons why this is a bad idea. And then we get to track and trace, which is a proposal put forward by Filippo Santoni DeCio and Jeroen Vandenhoven here at TU Delft and TPM in particular. And they have actually a really nice paper. I highly recommend people read it if they're interested in meaningful human control. It's philosophically, it has some depth to it. And they put forward two conditions that we need to meet in order to realize meaningful human control. The first is a tracking condition, which is about the machine being able to be responsive to human moral reasons for their outputs. So such that if a morally salient feature pops up in a context that would cause a human to change their decision or output, then it should also cause the algorithm to change its output. And the second is a tracing condition, which states that we should be able to trace responsibility back to a human being or set of human beings, such that that human being should knowingly accept moral responsibility and should be ready to accept the moral responsibility and accountability for the outcomes and outputs of the machine. All right, so moving to human-centered, meaningful human control. This is the classic on-the-loop, in-the-loop stuff. I think, and this is again about the human. Where is the human in this process, and what capabilities do they have? And on the loop, the human is kind of overseeing what the algorithm is doing, so that the human can intervene if necessary, to prevent something bad from happening. And I think a good example of this is Teslas, which kind of stipulate that the human has to be, have their hands on the wheel and be ready to take over at any time if something bad happens. And really, all moral responsibility is with the human. I think this is more of a way to protect their company from lawsuits than anything else. It doesn't seem to be a very good way of realizing or of having any meaningful human control of the machine, as it kind of flies in the face of human psychology and human capabilities to remain aware of their surroundings despite an automated process which works most of the time. There's some interesting work on that, I think, even from TU Delft. So I don't think it's meaningful human control, but it's an attempt at. I think that's what they're trying to do. It's just not working very well. And then in the loop is a little bit stronger than on the loop in that it requires a human to actually endorse or reject outputs of the machine before the consequences happen. So you're not just in an overseeing role anymore. You're actually a part of the process. Again, this kind of suffers from flies in the face of human psychology, in that we suffer from many biases like automation bias, assimilation bias, and confirmation bias, which is going to make this incredibly hard to be meaningful control, even though I think it could be said we are in control. So, and what I really want to say with all these is not that I want to, and the reason I don't go into specifics on my attacks on all of these positions is that I don't think it matters too much for the purposes of this paper. The real point that I want to make here is that even if some of these solutions or proposals will indeed play a part, and I think some aspects of them at least will play a part in meaningful human control, they're kind of working this all out after we've already made a huge mistake, when we've made a mistake. And we've already hit this iceberg, and now we're just rearranging the technologies and the people in the socio-technical system and hoping that everything will work out, but it doesn't matter. The ship's already sinking. And specifically, I think the mistake that gets made is that we've delegated a decision to a machine that machine should not have been delegated. And as soon as we've done that, no amount of technical wizardry or organization of the human and the technical system is going to fix that problem. We've already lost control, meaningful control over these algorithms. So that's what we have to figure out first, and that's what I plan to try to do in the next half of this presentation. So to jump to my conclusion that I will then defend is that machines should not have evaluative outputs. And specifically, machines should not be delegated evaluative decisions. And I consider evaluative outputs are things like criminal, suspicious, beautiful, propaganda, fake news, anything with bad, good, wrong, or right built into the labels or the outputs. So when we say somebody's suspicious, we're not just saying that somebody is standing around in one spot for a while with a ski mask on. We're not just saying, oh, that's interesting. No, we're saying it's bad. There's something bad about what's going on. We're loading a value into it. And we describe somebody as beautiful. We're not just saying that they have a particular outfit on or they look a certain way, just as a neutral manner. We're actually saying something good or something about the way people ought to look. And same with propaganda. We're not just saying that there's a picture with a political message. We're saying that there's something bad about this picture with a political message. It's not the way things should be. And so any of these outputs that have values built into them should not be delegated to machines. And I'm not just shadowboxing here. I think most of us here will know this, that these types of outputs have been delegated to machines quite frequently. There's no shortage of proposals to do this. These are 4 examples here, like detecting propaganda. And here I do want to make a little note that remind us that in the beginning I was talking about what I mean by a machine doing things. And sometimes algorithms are delegated the task of flagging propaganda, but that doesn't always mean that it's doing something in the way that I've talked about it doing. For instance, Europol flags propaganda, but they do it based on a hash that's generated by videos and pictures that have already been determined by human beings to be propaganda. And the idea then is just, is there a new post or a new picture, a new video that is the exact same as the one that was already posted and taken down? That's not a machine. That's just automating a process. We've already done the value judgment ourselves, and then we're just delegating the task of finding things that match those value judgments. In this case, I'm actually talking about a machine or an algorithm that detects propaganda and novel propaganda on its own. And then moving on to, we've had algorithms that detect criminals just based on their faces or purport to do so. AI that detects beauty, AI that detects fake news. We have one of my least favorite companies, hirevue, which is used by many Fortune 500 companies now, which purports to be able to say whether a candidate is okay, good, great, and fantastic, or and probably bad as well. And then I think one of the more infamous versions, which is the Chinese social credit system, which from my reading is trying to say what is a good citizen. So remember, these are all things that I'm saying algorithms shouldn't be delegated. And then the question becomes why? Why can't we delegate those things? And I want to put forward 2 arguments here. One has to do with efficacy, roughly that I'm going to argue that we can't say anything about the efficacy of these algorithms. And if we can't say anything about its efficacy, then we can't justify its use, and that any use of it is out of our control. We've lost control at that point. And then the second argument is more of an ethical argument about a more fundamental loss of control of meaningful human control over a process, and I will get more into that when I get to that section. So first, I want to say that efficacy is unknown in principle for evaluative outputs, and that each evaluative output is unverifiable. For example, suspicious, and in this example, in this picture here, this man is being labeled as suspicious, and in this judgment, this output here, and if we wanted to say, well, did the algorithm get this right? Was the algorithm correct in labeling this person suspicious? We, in principle, can't do that, because you might argue, well, wait, we can. If the person stole something, well, then they were indeed suspicious, but that's not what suspicious means. Suspicious somebody can be suspicious without doing anything wrong, and somebody can do something wrong or steal something without having been suspicious. It's called being a good thief. So if we can't evaluate whether the algorithm was correct on this one instance, and I'm arguing that it can't on any specific instance, then we can't say if this algorithm works or not at all. There's nothing we can say about the efficacy of this algorithm, and therefore we're kind of out of control. We've lost control. We're just using a tool that's as good as a magic 8-ball at that point. And this is opposed to an example like an algorithm that's supposed to detect weapons in baggage at the airport. In this instance, if an algorithm classifies this bag as having a weapon in it, or more specifically having a gun in it, we probably wouldn't just arrest the person on just the fact that the algorithm made such a labeling. We would look into the bag and find out, does it indeed have a weapon or a gun in it? And if it does, then we know the algorithm got it right at that point, and we can say something about the effectiveness of the algorithm because we can test this on many bags, on many examples, and determine how good it is at indeed detecting weapons. And then we can have some place in justifying its use. We can say it does indeed get it wrong sometimes, but we have a process to handle that because we have enough information to remain in control of this algorithm. The other thing I want to say about efficacy and using this suspicious label again is that the context changed over time. So 1 year ago, if this kid would have come into a store that I was in at night, I would have justifiably been worried and probably thought this person was suspicious. But I think in the context of a global pandemic, right now in the Netherlands, if I saw the same person wearing a mask in a store that I was in, I'd probably be thanking them for actually wearing a mask, as I see so little of here in the Netherlands, despite the spiking corona cases. So these contexts change, and that's something that algorithms are not good at. They're good at fixed, or machine learning algorithms specifically, they're good at fixed targets, something that they can get closer and closer to the truth with over more data. But value judgments are not those kinds of things. So we have to be, so even if we could solve the problem that I just outlined, which we can't tell whether it was, we can't verify any particular decision, that we did solve that problem, well, then we'd also have to worry about the context changing to make those considerations and make those considerations change that ground that judgment. All right, now moving into the ethics part of the argument, where I'm arguing for a more fundamental lack of control. What I mean by fundamental here, and it's different from the control that I see so often talked about, like in the autonomous weapons debate, where we're really thinking like, okay, we have this algorithm out there and it's targeting people. How do we make sure that there's still a human being around that can make sure, like, can take responsibility or have control over that process? What I mean with this fundamental part is that the control over choosing the considerations that ground our value judgments. So the actual process of deciding how the world ought to be in any of these contexts, that is a process that we have to remain in control over. It doesn't make sense to delegate that to anybody but ourselves. A machine's not going to be able to just decide how the world should be, and then we all change just because of an output of an algorithm. That doesn't make any sense. We have to decide how the world should be, and then create algorithms to help bring us there. So in the example of going over CVs to find a new candidate for a job, say in academia, we might say that there's certain considerations that are important for that. For instance, the number of publications, their reference letters, what they did their dissertation on. There'd be all these considerations that go into such an evaluation. And we usually have a committee to decide, like, how do we want to evaluate candidates for this particular position? Because it may not be the same considerations every time. And that conversation that we're having, not only as a small committee or as an individual, but as a society, to say what is a good academic, and then from there determining the considerations that will lead us to choosing those good academics or bad academics, or good candidates or bad candidates. That is our process. That's what we need to remain in control over. So delegating this, when we delegated an evaluative output to a machine, we are effectively ceding that more fundamental level of control. And then continuing on with this theme, even though we're having a conversation today about what a good academic is, or we did that, we were doing that 50 years ago. Now, things have changed drastically in the last, bunch of decades, or even in the last 10 years. I think even at TU Delft, you can see that certain characteristics or considerations are used that weren't used before about what a good academic is. For instance, valorization is much more important than it used to be. We've decided that that is part of what goes into making a good academic. Or maybe teaching is a little bit less important. Or maybe it's not the number of publications anymore, but the quality of their top publications. This is the conversation that we have, and it's also a conversation that changes as we learn new information or as the context around us changes. It's not that the value changes itself, but how we ground those values with considerations changes. So that should be left up to us to do. Next is this what I'm calling a vicious machine feedback loop. And it's a concern that I have that by delegating this evaluating process to machines, that we could be influenced by these machines on how we end up seeing values and grounding values. So the process starts with us, human beings, building these algorithms, training it, labeling the data, however that process works. We are doing that in our way, and it will always be biased. It may not be biased in a bad way, but it's still biased, even if it's just to the time that we live in. And then that feeds into an algorithm, which goes into an evaluative decision, which then spits out these evaluations to us. And over time, what I'm worried about is that we could be influenced by how the algorithm makes decisions. We could start seeing candidates for jobs differently because we've seen so many evaluations of an algorithm show us what a good candidate is, and then we start taking those things on. And this isn't an entirely new problem. It's happened before with other technologies, like even the media. We're constantly worried about feeding in the idea of who is beautiful and body shape and body image to children, for instance, or Barbies or something like that. All of this stuff feeds into their idea of what beautiful is and affects them later. And we usually talk about this in a negative way. We don't like that they're feeding in a specific body shape as the only way to be beautiful, and then that actually affects how they see it, which affects their way of trying to realize it and who they think is beautiful. Well, those same evaluations are now being delegated to AI, and we don't even know what considerations they're using. And I don't think not knowing is better than knowing and it's bad. They're both not a good effect on our evaluation, our ability to evaluate. The final thing I want to say about this ethical control argument is that people's behavior will adapt to evaluations. Part of the reason that we perform evaluations is to get people to we're saying how the world ought to be. If we're saying somebody did a great job, we're saying, well, if you want to do a great job too, you should do it more like this, or you should look more like this to be beautiful, or that's what evaluations do. Now, of course, that will change people's behavior. And in the case of AI, we've seen some of these overt changes where people figure out that AI is doing something, like these students who figured out that their tests were graded by AI and were able to achieve hundreds rather easily. That affects their behavior. And of course, in this situation, well, that's not behavior that we want to be. We don't want to change their behavior that way. That evaluation is failing. And that's partly because we haven't had the conversation. We're delegating the conversation about what it is we want, what behavior is good in taking a test, to a machine. And that doesn't, based on what I've said before, that doesn't make any sense. That's the whole thing. We have to determine what is good for a test, and then we can have AI help us evaluate it by picking out descriptive features of it. But it can't actually do that process for us. It can't pick out the considerations that make a good test or a good candidate or any of these things. That is us losing control over a process that is fundamentally our process. So then I started this, the whole thing is called What Machines Shouldn't Do. So I wanted to reiterate, I think some of it should be clear by now, but what I think machines shouldn't do based on the arguments that I've used. And the first is, they're all evaluative outputs, but aesthetic outputs. So judging what is beautiful or what is good, what's a good movie, what's a bad movie, what's a good song. We have algorithms that are trying to say what the next good movie is going to be. I think these don't make any sense based on what I've said. Not only can we not check if the algorithm works or not, but we can't. But we're losing control of that process of having that conversation about what is good, regard to the aesthetics. The same with the ethical and moral. We shouldn't be delegating the process of evaluating, of coming up with the considerations that evaluate candidates or citizens or anything like that to machines. That is our process. And finally, I add this last one in. I don't think it'll make the paper because I think it's a separate paper, but there's been so much talk of AI emotion detection that I wanted to mention it because I think it fails some of the same thing in the same way that some of the aesthetic and ethical or moral failures go. And that is, emotions are not verifiable in the way that the gun in the bag was. And furthermore, there doesn't seem to be, based on the science that I've read, anything more than pseudoscience grounding the idea that we can use AI to detect emotions. All right, so now I'm getting to the conclusion now. I think this is obvious, but unfortunately, based on all the examples I've shown, I think it still needs to be said. AI is not a silver bullet. It's not going to evaluate better than we can, and it's not going to tell us how the world should be. It can help us realize the world we've determined the way that it should be, but it's not going to be able to do this. This is fundamentally a human conversation, a human process that we need to keep going, and it will never stop, and then have the technologies around us help us realize those dreams. And then lastly, I want to keep artificial intelligence boring. I know it's not as exciting as being able to figure out ethics, determine exactly what a good person is, and then we just follow the machine. That would be really exciting if we could do that, but it's just not something that can be done. But I also don't want to be completely negative here. I think despite all of the last half an hour or so, I'm actually really positive about many of the benefits that artificial intelligence and machine learning could bring us. I just think that it needs to be more focused into the things that it's possible to achieve. And that is identifying the descriptive features, labeling those descriptive features that ground our evaluations. So instead of determining who is dangerous, it can determine a gun in a bag. Instead of determining who a good candidate is, it can rank the CVs based on number and number of publications. It's hard to read 100 CVs, but a machine learning algorithm could probably do it really fast, and we could verify that it was doing it correctly. This is still hugely beneficial, and I think we underestimate the power that could be. So I'm going to leave it there. I really appreciate you guys listening to me for the last half hour, and I look forward to your questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in like a minute just so I can see everybody. I feel quite alone when I'm looking at it like this. So, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was very insightful. And we actually have a few questions already in the chat. So okay. While I'm reading those, I would appreciate if people write their question, or at least the indication that they have a question in the chat, because there are already quite a few of them. So if you raise a hand, I might as well miss it. So I'll start with the first question that arrived, I think, 30 seconds after you started your talk. So that was from Inod. So yes. Inod, would you like to ask your first question yourself?
Yes, thanks, Scott, for your presentation. Very nice. I got stuck when you started to explain the difference between automated and delegated. And
yeah, I was worried about it.
As I wrote in the chat, if you take the example of face recognition, right? Then there are face recognition systems that make use of explicit selected facial features, like position of your nose, distance between the eyes, color of the eyes, etc., etc. And there are some that learn these features, and we do not know necessarily what kind of features that are. Both, of course, have the same effect, namely they recognize people, they classify people, etc., etc. But one you would call automated, because we as humans select the features, and the other is delegated, and I don't get that. Why it is even important to make that distinction?
Well, I think it's fundamentally important because in one case, we're deciding what features are important for grounding and a decision in the end. And so it's the control problem, right? We have that control. But if we are delegating that to a machine, which is fine, in facial recognition, I have lots of problems with facial recognition, but not for this reason, is that algorithms, machine learning algorithms specifically, are able to use its own considerations, and it becomes more powerful. And the way that I mean by that is that it's not confined to what we can think of or human articulable reasons. It actually has a host of other reasons that we could never understand. I think that's what gives it its power, but it does matter because one is going to be explainable and one's not.
So what is that the word then? So I was looking for that word, explainability. So the distinction between automated and delegated is whether or not it's explainable.
I think that would be, so it would just be a clarity issue then I think that works fine for me, but I prefer the delegated the decision because I think that makes it more clear. Maybe for my community, but I'll leave it to them.
Now you gave a very, if I may, you gave a very nice example of a decision tree with 2 levels in the tree, right?
Yeah.
Realistic decision trees have thousands of levels.
Of course, yeah.
So here we go. Is that explainable? Yeah. So you see, I mean,
it's fundamentally explainable.
The boundary between the two, huh?
Yeah, but it's fundamentally explainable, right? Whether you have 1,000 levels or 2 levels, you can still explain it. I mean, somebody could explain it in the end. We could, in principle, get an explanation. But with machine learning, we can't, right now, at least in principle, get an explanation. So there is a difference between the two.
I'm very interested about this because you mentioned as one example the AI that was used to determine whether someone should be hired or not, or the quality of candidates.
Right.
And I think you made really good points against that being used. But when you are talking about this, I'm wondering, would you say it's perfectly fine to use an AI if it's a GoFi, good old-fashioned AI with a decision tree behind it, and only problematic when we use machine learning?
Right. So I think it is. So there might be other problems associated with GoFi in that situation, but I think we still have, I mean, the way or the arguments that I've made today, we still have control over what considerations are grounding the evaluation. So for example, if we're using a hiring algorithm that's basically just saying, how many, if it's in the academic sphere, is there, do they have greater than 5 publications, and did they get a PhD that has the word ethics in it? And those are the only 2 things we care about, separating out the things. Well, of course, we can argue about whether that's good. Those are considerations are good, but it's still us deciding what considerations there are. So it doesn't fall foul to what I've talked about today. It still may be problematic, but not for this reason.
Okay. So if we move on to the next question. Providing a link to the paper, somebody posted it already. Then we had a question from Minold about having a disease. Would that be an evaluative output? Minold, can you clarify what the question was about?
I see it right now.
The question is pretty clear, huh?
Yeah, pretty clear. Don't worry. So I think I use the example in my paper sometimes about detecting skin cancer, and an algorithm. There's algorithm that can look at a mole and take that as an input and evaluate whether you have skin cancer or not. So this I don't think is evaluative because it's verifiable, right? We can just take a biopsy and say, well, did the algorithm get it right or not? It's a 0 or 1. Do you have skin cancer or not? So in that case, it's not an evaluative output. No, there's no evaluation. I mean, I guess if it was more mental, if we consider mental issues, diseases.
That's the next line in the question. Exactly that one.
Well, then it's. I think there's a blurry line there, but I'd not experienced enough in that field to know whether.
So I have a very strong feeling that, and I think I saw that somewhere in the chat window as well, that what you're worried about is whether or not there's a ground truth, an objectively verifiable ground truth.
I think that is, yeah. I mean, we could say that. I'm happy with that language.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Thanks.
Okay. Good. No now we have a question from David. He is wondering whether you can equate evaluative outputs with outputs of moral evaluation. So is there necessarily a moral component, or maybe you can clarify that?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk also, Scott. I think Inald just touched upon it in the previous talk. So I was wondering what you mean with evaluation, and I think the ground truth part, that's probably more general than moral evaluation. But I had the feeling you were thinking about moral evaluation mostly than just evaluation.
Like I said in the talk, it's also aesthetic evaluation. Anything with value attached to it. But I think that does. I think the verifiability here is very important, and it may indeed be easier just to say, is there this ground truth and verifiability part of it? I think that could be possible. I need to think more about it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, now we have another question from Minold, also drilling down on the
No, let's take someone else. Come on, Arkady.
We'll skip this one. So we have a question from Jared then about the kind of the gray area between evaluative outputs and something more objective. Jared, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so thank you, very interesting presentation. And so one thing I was thinking about is that it would be trivially easy for pretty much all examples you gave to reframe them as if they are not giving evaluative outputs, but more like objective judgments. So you can say the AI does not evaluate applicants, it judges similarity to other applicants based on or as ranked on suitability. Right. And you can sort of reframe what your AI does to something objective, and then say, yeah, it's just meant to inform people. The people make the decisions, and we just do this objective bit that informs the decision. And I have a feeling that focusing on evaluative outputs might not be the right emphasis, but I'm not completely sure, and I just wanted to throw it at you and see what's...
And I'm worried about that too. I'm intentionally making this bold so that I can get pushback. But I think what you just said is I like that better in terms of we're just finding applicants that are like the applicants that or the people that we've hired in the past that we've classified as good. So we've done that process of judging whether they're good. However, what considerations are grounding that similarity part? We don't know how it's reaching that similarity. So I think it still falls foul to that. And what I think, and in my more hopeful parts about AI, instead of trying to find, what applicants are good based on the applicants of the past that we've determined as good, we should figure out, well, maybe we should think about what makes them good. What is it about them that makes them good? And then when we determine that, then we can use AI. Perhaps we need AI to automate being able to find that feature and to be able to sort those applications. That's what I really want, because you can't say, because this suitability thing, I think it's a nice workaround, and I'm sure the technology companies will do it because it makes it sound better and it forces more of the responsibility to human beings. But I don't think it's a justified or a meaningful control then. I mean, what's the difference between more suitable and like our better applicants from the past and just a good candidate? It's basically amounts to the same exact thing, and it falls into the same problems.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Sylvia. Sylvia, can you plug in and ask the question?
Yes. If I can also just add something about what Jared was saying, that I think it would at least be an improvement that it's clarified what the AI actually does. So, for example, matching similar CV, because in terms of socio-technical system, at least you remove the tendency to trust that then the AI is going to have this additional capability respect to us, and we should trust then what the computer is saying. Maybe.
I agree. I think it's a step forward to do it like that. It's definitely a big step forward. It still falls victim to some what I've said, but it's a step forward. I agree.
Yeah. But no, what I wanted to ask you is, I mean, I actually don't mind your idea of saying, okay, let's keep it boring, because to me it just sounds like just keep it within the boundaries of what it actually could do, because it can't do these contextual kind of evaluations. But doesn't it just boils down then to it can verify very well tangible things like objects, like your gun example, or the checking the moles and possible skin cancer against then intangible things. So is it boiling down to let's just keep it to objects or things?
Well, I mean, I think much hinges on the verifiability. I mean, earthquakes are tangible. Like we could predict earthquakes with an algorithm, and we would only know after the fact if it got it right. But you might be right. It might be just tangible. It depends on what we mean by tangible. That's possible. But really, I think the keyword is verifiability. Is can we verify it after the fact or during? And I think that will matter when we can verify it. But if we can't verify it at all, which I'm trying to say that all evaluative judgments cannot be verified, so we can't do that. And I'm trying to give an easier way, and maybe verifiability just is easier, and pragmatically I should just be using that. I'm open to that, and I will be thinking about that more. But yeah, so I will think about that.
Then can I just leave you with like a sort of like devil's advocate provocation?
Absolutely.
Because then it's the question that I would ask myself, which
Right.
is, we can't verify an evaluation from a human either. If the judge decides that that was, or a jury, if you're in a common law system, then that was suspicious, you're gonna fall into the same problem. So someone that really wants to use the algorithm might say, but then let's make it, statistically sound or whatever, like the Lombroso nightmare that was with the criminal behavior AI. And so I might say, well, whether it's a human or an AI, we still can't verify that evaluation. So let's just save money and use the AI anyway. That would be my biggest problem.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. We can't. I'm saying evaluative judgments aren't verifiable, so it's not going to be verifiable if a human does it either. But I think, and if I can go back to using the phrase, saying how the world ought to be and how people ought to be, that is up to us to do. And the idea that we're going to use a tool to do that instead doesn't make any sense, especially if we can't say anything about its efficacy. So, if I'm right, and I think I find it hard to create an opposing argument to say, well, no, actually, it doesn't matter how we come to the decision about how the world ought to be. That doesn't matter. We just need to accept, we just need to accept one so that it's easier for the machine to get there. I don't think that just doesn't make any sense to me, but it's something that needs to be worked out more. But I think there's definitely a difference between a human not being able to making an evaluation and us not being able to evaluate it versus a machine making an evaluation. And I think one of the big differences is that a human can explain themselves about how they came to that decision and what considerations they used, and we can have a disagreement about whether the considerations they used were indeed okay. And of course, we can get into the idea that humans can be deceptive. They're going to lie about how they came to the decision. They were very biased against a particular person, but they're not going to say that. They're going to try to use objective means. But the responsibility falls on them, then, we shouldn't be delegating that process to a machine.
Okay, Herman, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott. I really liked your paper. But I also have a question on something that has been touched on quite a few times already. So the verifiability of an evaluative judgment. Yeah. So I still struggle with understanding what you mean exactly with that. So do you want to say that nothing is suspicious, nothing is wrong, nothing is beautiful? Because if some things are beautiful, then we can just check whether the output corresponds to reality. So in your answer that you just gave, you seem to hint that we want to verify the reasoning behind the judgments. And that seems to be something different. So is it the last thing that you're interested in, that the reasoning should be verifiable, or is it the output that is?
Well, I think both play a role. First of all, it's the output, and so I think with algorithms, they're in computer science, it's zeros and ones, and I think we should be thinking about we should be working towards. And I know all the Bayesian stuff, but I'm not going to get into that. But I think first, at least, even if I accept that there might be a possibility that we could verify what's beautiful or not, which I think there's a lot of complications in that, because then it's going to be culturally specific, even person specific. Not that there's no somewhat of it, even if it's a human constructed truth over it, there may be. You might be right. Then I think that's why I added in all those reasons about context changing, our considerations grounding these judgments are changing. Movies that were amazing 50 years ago, if the same movie came out today, we'd be like, well, it's kind of tired. It's not something that we're interested. That's not beautiful anymore. And it's because the context has changed. We've already heard the Beatles. We can't have a new Beatles out anymore. Somebody has to evolve. And even with how the world ought to be, the context changes, the climate changes, global pandemic, how we live our lives now, the fact that we're doing this digitally. Instead, these considerations change. And so not that there can't be any truth at the moment right now, but that algorithms are not good about this shifting context and this shifting situation about how we ground our judgments. What what a mountain looks like overall is pretty much static, right? I mean, there's some differences in different mountains, but overall, an algorithm trained on trying to find spot mountains is going to get closer and closer to being able to be better and better at it. But that's not the case with evaluative judgments. So you might be right. We might be able to just say, well, look, everybody agrees that's beautiful. The algorithm got it right. But then we have to worry about this changing context. And that's if we can get everybody to agree on those things, which I doubt is going to happen.
Yeah, so of course there are many meta-aesthetic and meta-normative views that contradict some of the things that you just said. So maybe you could be very explicit that you're endorsing a specific.
But I'd be curious to know. I'd be curious to hear if any, because I do read a little bit of meta-ethics, especially not meta-aesthetics, but even if, like, for instance, moral realism is true and that there are mind-independent moral truths out there, I don't see, unless we can access them, which I have not, the moral epistemology behind that is exceptionally difficult, and there's no solution to it yet. But if we can't access them at this point, and then the algorithm, we'll say people have hubris, they believe the algorithm can actually access them. This algorithm is actually better than us. It can actually detect the real moral truths. Well, then we'd be left in a situation where we have to just trust that that's the case. We'd have to say, well, yeah, I guess we should kill 5 to say kill 5 instead of killing the 1 on the trolley problem. I didn't know that was true, but the algorithm said it's true. And it's like, why? How would we ever trust that? It doesn't. Even if the meta-ethics were such that there were moral truths, I don't see that solving the problem. So I'm not sure that mine is dependent on a meta-ethical viewpoint at this point. But I think it's really interesting, and I think we should talk about that more.
Let's do that, Scott.
Okay, next in line is Madeleine. Madeleine, do you think your question hasn't been answered before? Because this goes into context for evaluative judgments.
Yeah, so this is funny. The question has just become more complicated, I think, in the last. So maybe I just push a little bit to say, okay, so I'm just wondering about whether or not if this output of a evaluative statement is evaluative at all. So if the AI, this program says this is beautiful, that what it's really doing is saying, I've processed this data and here's what you people seem to think is beautiful in this particular moment, in this particular context. So it seems like I'm not so strong on the technical side here, but it seems like if you're using machine learning, this is a learning process and would be able to adapt to a certain context. So I'm just wondering if this, I guess I'm just challenging the idea that an AI program could come up with an evaluative statement at all.
Well, I think you're right. I think I should clarify that more. That, I mean, yeah, machines don't have any intentions. They don't have any viewpoints or anything like that. They're just doing the statistical analysis. But practically, when people use hirevue, the algorithm, they're getting an evaluative output. And no matter how you could try to put a disclaimer in there consistently, saying like, this is not a real evaluation. This is simply, and put I have in my paper on explainability this great explanation of why AlphaGo made a particular move in the game of Go, or how it comes to a particular move. And really, this is what the algorithm's doing. Of course, it's like really over anybody's head that's not in machine learning. And I think the practical situation is that people are using these algorithms and taking it as an evaluative judgment. And if we're not going to, and I think language is really important here, and that's why I said we're going in a step forward if we're saying that this algorithm has determined that this candidate is similar to these 3 candidates that were considered good by you before. That's going a step in the right direction for sure. I still don't like it, but it's more accurate to say it like that, even if it's not as exciting to say it like that.
So the concern is about the practical use and how it's taken up by people.
No, I think that's also a concern for sure.
Okay.
But I don't really think it solves the problem to just stipulate that the algorithm is coming up with this person is the most similar to these three candidates that you've had before. Similar how? I mean, that how is so important. You can't just disregard the how they're similar. They're similar because they're white males. I mean, that's what Amazon's algorithm did. That how was fundamentally important. So I think we can't. I think it's just this nice, clever little trick that some companies are doing to say like, oh well, we can just make this little move with language and change the whole game. No, the same problems exist, in my opinion.
Thanks.
All right, I think I'm next. Is there still enough time, Arkady? Can you hear me?
3 minutes. Yeah, sorry, I was
Okay.
muted. I was talking all this time. Yeah, I said that we have 3 minutes, and the next in line is Rule. So go on. And it would be great if we could also get to Kataline's question.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. Great to be here. Scott, thanks for your talk. I really appreciated it. I think one thing you're doing is like taking the focus off of the technology of the logic, etc., and giving arguments to motivate us to look at the practice and all the choices we're making. And that's where I've spent a lot of my time in the last couple of years as well. Like I have a specific question about delegation. Yeah, where you draw the line. But before I say that, like I would want to point to one thing I did myself was to start looking at all the different choices that people make. And a lot of what you're talking about is like, how do you determine what a label is and what can you capture in the label? And is that thing that you're capturing, is that like an epistemologically sound thing that you can verify? Mm-hmm. So I like the idea of verification, but I also think that just having a ground truth or not having a ground truth would be too rough of a categorization to not use it. Because there are many applications, for instance, in biology where you don't really have a ground truth, but it's still very useful to use evaluations based on our best guesses, and then have a machine like run analysis for us, just as an example. But I will just say that, and I'll leave the question because I think you've already said enough about context and delegation and all that. Okay, thanks.
Right. Yeah, one last minute. Kataline, are you still with us?
I'm still with you, yes.
Yeah, go on decision trees.
I will be quick. So regarding your answer to Enol's earlier question about explainability, you said, well, in principle, the decision tree would be explainable if you have 1,000 layers. Yes, the principle of that is explainable, but that holds also for deep learning. So is that then an essential difference? Because, of course, a 1,000-layer network is not comprehensible for people in general.
Wait, you're saying that in the same way that a decision tree of 1,000 layers is explainable, so is deep learning?
Yes.
Okay, so that goes against what I understand as deep learning. I mean, the whole problem with the whole field of explainable AI is to attempt to solve the problem that we can't explain, how deep learning algorithms come to the outputs that they come to. So, but I'm not a machine learning expert, so
you can explain the fundamentals of it, how you construct these things, how they work.
Okay, so sorry. The explanation that I'm looking for is you can explain. There's many different types of explanations. You're right, but the difference between the two, in one, the decision tree, you can actually explain the features and considerations which led to the output, which played a factor in the output, and maybe even how much they played a factor into the output. Whereas in the deep learning situation, you cannot do that anymore.
I would agree with that. I would agree. In principle, you could ask back, like, why did you make this decision, and get a comprehensible answer from a decision layer. Yeah,
exactly. And so that's what's really important to me here, is those considerations that played a factor. Yeah.
Happy with that.
Yeah. The next question is mine, but unfortunately we don't have time for that question, and also for all the remaining questions, which I have to admit are really exciting. So feel free to get in touch with Scott later to discuss those. I will. So thanks again, Scott. That was a fascinating talk. And,
thanks to everybody. Thanks again for the invitation. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for the questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to go through all of them.
Okay, see you all next week. Next week, our speaker will be Jared. So looking forward to that.